Hello, my name is Simon Trafford. I'm a lecturer in medieval history here at the Institute, and it's my considerable pleasure to chair this final session on the work and legacy of Susan. Just very briefly, using the indulgence given to a chair, if I could just mention the sort of my own recollections of Susan as redoubtable presence. I mean, somebody who very adjectival. Redoubtable is one I would definitely use in Susan. But I'd also mention, as when I gave a seminar to the early Middle Ages seminar, just firstly my terror, basic terror, but also of extreme kindness, and that she was just a wonderful person to talk with, to expose your scholarship to. So in this session, we'll be first of all actually hearing from Susan herself. By way of a talk that, an interview with her, recorded in 2008 as part of the Making History project. We'll just hear a few minutes of this interview. The whole thing, actually, there is it's the cabinet just to the left of the door as you go out. There's a QR code there which opens the link to this full thing, which is on the IHR website. So you will be able to, you can listen to this in full at another time. But really, it's great just to have a voice here with us. So I'll just...
This interview has been conducted for the Making History, the Discipline in Perspective project, and the project officer Danny Millen will be speaking to Susan Reynolds about her experience of and views on changes in the discipline and academic profession of history. Susan, would you be able to give a brief biographical background of yourself for us?
Right. Well, I immediately after taking my first degree at Oxford, I trained as an archivist and went into archives. I worked as an archivist at Middlesex County Record Office for a year, and then I went into the Victoria County History, where I worked for 7 years. And between the archive training and the VCH was really the equivalent of my PhD. It was my training. I haven't got a PhD. I haven't even got an MA in history, though I've got a diploma in archive administration. And working for the VCH was fun, but then I didn't want to do it all my life, and I thought I wanted to do teaching, so I went and taught in school. First of all in secondary modern school, which was very educational for 2 terms, and then in a girls' independent school, where at first I felt I was going to fall forward because there was sort of so little coming at me, as there had been in the secondary modern, but I enjoyed that a lot. And I wouldn't have moved into university teaching if it hadn't been suggested to me. And this, I think, is actually quite an interesting story, because I must have been one of the last people appointed to a university job through an old girl network. This was the winter of 63-64,
right,
when there had been a lot of new universities just opened. And my predecessor, who had been my tutor, teaching medieval history at Lady Margaret Hall, was going to retire. And there weren't many women about. They had to have a woman, you see, to be a fellow of a women's college.
Right.
And women on the whole didn't do so much postgraduate work. And if they did, they tended to be married and having babies. And they were not very mobile, or indeed employable full-time, or didn't want to be employed full-time. And so I got this letter, a manuscript letter, from the principal of my own college, where I had not got a first, I may say, but I had kept a little bit in touch.
Mm-hmm.
And this manuscript letter said, "Dear Miss Reynolds, Miss Reynolds is retiring," or words to that effect, who was my predecessor, "and we wondered if you'll come to lunch one Sunday." So I went to lunch, and it was extraordinary. I mean, some people... Oh yes, before I went to see the principal, I went to see the other history tutor who had rung me up and told me I was to come and see her first. And she then kept saying, "Well, you'll be teaching this and I'll be teaching that." And I was a bit sort of flummoxed. And then I went to see the principal, and 3 other people came in to have drinks before lunch. They were the selection committee, for goodness sake. And that was all that happened. And after about a month, actually, I was a bit worried. What was happening? Was I going to be summoned for an interview? And I'd already consulted my ex-boss and friends, and I wasn't sure I wanted to do this. But it seemed crazy not to do something, to refuse a change if it was offered to you. And in the end, the delay was simply because they had to wait for the next meeting of the governing body and all that. But so anyway, that's how it landed up at LMH in Oxford. And I went into it very much for teaching. I enjoyed teaching a lot. And I had actually more or less given up doing medieval history. I had been editing a text which my ex-boss on VCH, well, while he was still my boss, put me onto. He was very determined that his assistants should be improving their careers, and made me edit a text in evenings.
And who was your boss at the time?
This was Ralph Pugh, who was a bit of a character, but he was a very good boss. He was very benevolent, and he quarrelled with people a bit, but if you treated him straight, he was fine. I learned a lot from him. And but I'd more or less finished that text finally, and I thought I might toy with some 19th century history, because medieval history is very unsuitable to do in evenings, because you know, all the sort of medieval history I was thinking of, sort of with documents and so on. So I'd really given up medieval history, so I had to take it up again. And I decided I'd do something on urban history, medieval urban history, because that linked up with my local history. Barbara Harvey of Somerville was wonderful. She gave me lists of essays, topics to set, and books to read. And during that summer I worked very hard, but I was pretty ignorant.
And that was in preparation for your teaching?
That was for teaching, that's right. It was the teaching that really preoccupied me. And the first year or so I was pretty ignorant, but I gradually sort of accumulated knowledge. And meanwhile I got keener and keener on research, so that after, well, by about 20 years there, I was getting a bit stale, partly because I was more and more interested in the research, and therefore spending less and less time on doing new things in teaching. So the teaching got staler.
And that was by the early 80s?
That's by the early 80s. And so then I decided to leave a bit early. It was really because an American friend who did medieval history, who had stayed in my London flat, not this one, but that doesn't matter, while I was in Oxford once, he had got a whole year's leave coming up from his job at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire.
Right.
He thought it'd be nice for him and his wife to spend the year in London. So he had to get rid of me, as it were. So, because I had always had a flat in London that I occupied in vacations, which I found worked very well, really, because I liked the British, I liked the IHR and the British Library more than Bodley and so on. Anyway, so he asked me to go and do his teaching for a year at Dartmouth. Now, I wasn't entitled to leave, because I quite recently had some. So I decided to leave. At that stage I was 58, so I had to do two and a half years, or I suppose I was 57. Anyway, I had to do 2.5 years with that before I could get a pension, and it wouldn't be such a big pension, but you see, I'm single.
Mm-hmm.
And my first year I was paid at Dartmouth, and then I just had a small gap. So that was fascinating, Dartmouth. I really loved it. But it was an awful waste to accumulate the knowledge for teaching there in a quite different system for just 1 year and then be retiring. But never mind, it was great. So then after that, that was 86 I left Oxford. 87 I stopped teaching at Dartmouth. So I've actually been retired for as long as I was teaching.
But retired, I suppose, as
Retired from gainful employment.
as many historians are,
Yes,
from
right.
gainful employment, but not from the
I'm
act
working,
of
that's right.
conducting
Because the
research.
chief reason why I retired, I was getting a bit stale, but I wanted to work on this subject of feudalism,
Mm-hmm.
which my friend Peggy Brown, who must count as one of the important figures in my field of research, who's American. She wrote this wonderful article in 1974 called The Tyranny of a Construct, Feudalism and Historians, just saying what the hell do historians mean by this word. We did think at first we would write a joint book, but actually it was much better that we didn't, because we have different views about footnotes and all kinds of things.
So that would have made things complicated.
It would have made things complicated, and she was busy with other things. So I went ahead and wrote a book which simply concentrated on the two key aspects of non-Marxist feudalism, that is fiefs and vassalage. And she read it all, and gave me criticisms and so on, but I did it on my own, and that was really what I did for the first few years of my retirement, and then I went on from there.
I'm so sorry to cut it off, but you can carry on listening to that for the full hour very, very easily. But it's wonderful to have heard that voice, to have heard that wit, that charm again. But now it would be great if I could welcome John Gillingham, who of course needs no introduction, Professor Emeritus at LSE, and his work considers considers primarily northwestern Europe in the 11th to 13th centuries.
It was indeed wonderful to hear Susan's voice, because it reminds me of the first time I ever tried to meet Susan. Back in the early 60s, while I was an undergraduate, I had a girlfriend called Susan Reynolds. And when I came to London, she lived in London. When I came to London, I thought I would try and get in touch with her again. And so I rang the only Susan Reynolds I could find. And after 2 words, Susan Reynolds, speak 3, speak, I knew it wasn't Susan Reynolds. So my first successful contact was initiated by her, and I think very characteristic of her. I had just written a book on the Walls of the Roses, the book which had no footnotes at all. And she sent me a card out of the blue, and saying how much she had enjoyed it. Wonderful concrete stuff, she wrote about it. And that was my first, this was an act of the kindness of strangers, as far as I'm concerned. Too many things came to mind as I was listening to that. Like her, I retired from active gainful employment at the end of my 50s. Like her, I never got a PhD or a master's degree. But I think that's one of the few ways in which we are similar, were similar. Anyway, I thought Dr. Watson, I should say something that I was asked to talk about her legacy. Obviously, it's far too early to do anything like that, but about her works, I should say something about feudalism. And I haven't actually read elsewhere anything about the reception of her great book in Germany. And so I'd like to quote an excellent historian of das Lebenswesen, Michael Stephan Putzel, who began an article he wrote with these words: Susan Reynolds und Charles de Gaulle haben eines gemeinsam. Sie haben Schlachten verloren, aber den Krieg gewonnen. That was in 2013, he wrote. I mean, she certainly had lost some battles early on. There was a leading article in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, the big headline of which was English historians attempt to turn medieval historical research upside down has failed. Ist gescheitert. Clearly, by the time we get to 2008, 2010, 2011, there are conferences being held in Germany to assess Susan's work and to show how what she did made a dramatic turning point in the kind of perception in that part of the world too of das Wesen, fiefs, vassals, all that stuff. Now I'd like to say, draw attention to a couple of my favourite things about Susan's writings. The first is my favourite article, which is one that was published in the Transactions of the Royal Historical Society for 1991. It was entitled Social Mentalities and the Case of Medieval Skepticism. In that, she said, historical tradition does not seem to have made enough allowance for the fact that nearly all our information comes from the clergy. And in consequence, as she says, although medievalists now seldom use the expression, the idea of the age of faith survives amongst us, like a shabby old chair in our sitting room. A bit rickety, but now smartened up with new loose covers called heresy and popular religion. Her refusal to go along with that view of whether or not it could be genuine, whatever that is, skepticism in the medieval period, reflects the fact that was observed by the editors of Festschrift that, I quote, she constantly maintained that medieval people are like us in essential ways. It is indeed a point she had made back in 1982, and to take up David Bates's point earlier, she made it in the Urban History Yearbook in 1982, when she wrote, even if some of us are a bit hazy about what modern lawyers mean by incorporation, the fact that we are muddles does not necessarily make us medieval. But I fear that although I would say she's been entirely successful in destroying an old model of feudalism, people go on talking about Fiefs and Vassals, of course, I think this is one way in which today her legacy has not yet, perhaps never will, break through. Seems to me that historical tradition still does not make enough allowance for the fact that nearly all our information comes from the clergy. Second, my favourite sentence in all of Susan's published writings. It is the first sentence of her introduction to the second edition of Kingdoms and Communities in Western Europe, which was second edition published in 1997. First sentence is, a dozen years later, I have not changed my mind about the arguments I put forward in the first edition. And later in that introduction, she says, a couple of pages on, my work since 1984 has convinced me more firmly than ever. The more I have tried to compare, the more convinced I have become. And I think, that frequent use of the first person singular, I, good for Susan, is absolutely characteristic too. She writes in that same introduction, it is still my contention, as it was in 1984, that what the academics, polemicists and lawyers wrote actually merely articulated and refined the old ideas rather than producing entirely new ones. Whatever, she went on to say, whatever intellectuals think is affected by what their unintellectual neighbours take for granted. Intellectuals, even those who write in the society's vernacular, and even those who have access to ample technologies of popularization, surely do not have as big an effect on their society's values and assumptions as their societies and values assumptions have on them. Actually, I haven't adequately reflected the punctuation. That sentence, society's values and assumptions have on them, sentence beginning should, ends with a quotation mark. I mean, I'm not sure that's a misprint, because it seems to me that very, very, very few of Susan's sentences end with a question mark. I mean, clearly, perhaps it's a rhetorical question. Susan was all in favour, of course, we'll hear it time and again, of asking questions, but she was telling you what her answers to those questions were. And she would say, you're entitled to disagree with me, of course. Fair enough, I hope you will. She came to regret the title Kingdoms and Communities because, as she wrote in 1997, I was seduced by alliteration into using a word, communities, which has virtually lost all meaning. Hence, she said, better would have been lay collective activity. I meant it to be about the ideas of lay people and thought that they could best be explored through the evidence of their activities. Which meant that she was ready, and others, she said, were not, to take the risk of inferring attitudes and values about collectivities from charters, chronicles, and laws. As she had said back in 1984, to understand the ideas which informed lay collective activities, we need to look not at treatises written by intellectuals, but at the records of lawsuits, charters, and chronicles. I always found it difficult to argue with Susan, because I agreed so fundamentally with her basic presuppositions that they were just like us, we rely too much on stuff the clergy and intellectuals wrote. But what she didn't do, seriously, in her work, was she didn't really use chronicles very much. She always included chronicles among her sources, but it was almost always costumals, charters, codes of law. This is because she was interested, of course, in property rights and property, perhaps from her family background. Whereas I've been much more interested in human rights, whether or not kill people, whether or not take them prisoner, whether or not you enslave them. Now, from Susan's point of view, she had said this before in that essay in the Urban History Yearbook. When I try and investigate thought, I do not mean primarily academic thought of clerical treatises on which discussion is generally and misleadingly concentrated, but lay secular political thought, the ideas and assumptions which determined those social and political norms implied in charters, lawsuits, and costumals. It was her conviction, and David brings this out very nicely in his British Academy memoir on Susan, as she really felt that new practices evoked new theory, not the other way round. And 10 years earlier still, in an article in History, 1972, on the men she called the rulers of London in the 12th century. And this is the first article of hers I can actually remember reading as when I started teaching. And it already contains themes which would be familiar later. If we are to make any progress in understanding, we must look critically both at the evidence itself and at the words with which we transmute it into history. And we must be aware of running our interpretations along the tram lines of social and political attitudes which earlier historians thought appropriate. She included in the article back in 1972 one preliminary suggestion. She said, discussion will be much better if we drop the word patrician forever. And I'm sure that readiness to drop words is what made her respond so strongly to Peggy Brown saying, let's drop the feudal word. When she talked about the tram lines of older scholars, this didn't have to mean that she was dismissive of tram-travelling historians themselves. It's just if they pick themselves up to say this is the model by which society works, she was a bit hard on them. She pointed out, for example, that the great James Tate on medieval English boroughs got himself up a bit of a blind alley on borough status. But she continued, I reckon that he found more significant information up his alley than most of us find on our motorways. Susan herself dated her interest in the collective activities of medieval lay people and the solidarities that underlay them to being awakened sooner after she started work on medieval English towns in the mid-60s. And this is really elaborating what David Bates has said earlier. And I often think that her book on 1977, as Introduction to the History of Medieval English Towns, has been underestimated. Its title, in my view, should be an introduction to thinking about medieval English towns. When Ralph Griffiths and I were asked to write a kind of short history of Britain in the Middle Ages and put a guide to further reading, just a few select titles, and the press wanted us to add half a sentence or so characterization of each book we were recommending. I described that book as the thinking man's guide to the history of English medieval towns. That, I should say, was in 1984, I think, when it got reprinted as a very short introduction by OUP in 2000. I changed it to the thinking person. So, like most people of my generation, I've certainly learned to mind my language slightly, even if you may think the underlying attitudes didn't change at all. I think that book was so important because it reflected the hard thinking she had been doing, and which she then invited the reader to think along with her, think hard about words which had always been used loosely. Not just words like patriciate and guilds, or borough status and so on, but also wider concepts such as decay and decline. These were all things that you knew what do you mean when you say that? And if I haven't minded my own words sufficiently in saying what I particularly like about Susan's approach, I apologise to her.
Thanks ever so much, John. Our next speaker is Professor Alice Taylor from King's, who, as I'm sure you know, writes mainly on Scotland and on Scottish law.
Not only. Not mainly. More. It's a real honour to be here, and I should say that owing to a clash of teaching, which is odd because it is the holidays, I wasn't actually able to be here for the first two sessions. So I do apologise if I'm saying things that other people have already said. It's through ignorance, not because I think they haven't been very well said. My own kind of recollection of Susan comes from being, somebody who was very, very not her generation. I was obviously not a student because, as has been said before, she didn't have PhD students. And in fact, I wasn't even based in London. I was an interloper to the IHL seminars. And I was just thoroughly kind of taken aback by meeting the writer of Fiefs and Vassals. And I think if I had read Kingdoms and Communities instead of Fiefs and Vassals, I may have found Susan quite surprising. But because I read Fiefs and Vassals, she was in many ways encapsulating of that book when you first meet her. So much so that Susan, who was incredibly supportive of me, particularly through my PhD and postdoctoral years, when I once kind of sent her an article that she really did not like, she did not like it at all. I remember in the acknowledgements to the article when it came out in print was, I'd like to thank X, Y, and Z, but particularly to Susan Reynolds for her heavy critique. Now, in her first collection of collected essays, Susan described herself, as John's just said, as fundamentally a historian of the collective activities of medieval people and the solidarities that underlay them. Her second collection, The Middle Ages Without Feudalism, is framed really around Fiefs and Vassals. It's her kind of exploration, her afterwards to Fiefs and Vassals. And the themes of both solidarities, law, hierarchies, collectivities. And these are the themes that she herself described as underpinning her work. And today I want to take a different tack and consider her work as a whole in 10 minutes as offering a profound, but also I think unresolved critique of historical narratives that either explicitly or implicitly are based on the paradigm of modernity. And she does this through a historical method which foregrounds the limitations and the unknowability of language. And I should say, I don't think Susan would have framed her work in these terms, and indeed as I said the word modernity, she probably would have kind of let out an exasperated guffaw at the idea, but I think, in fact I know she would have heard me out, even if she did interrupt. So what I mean by modernity is actually the term from sociology. It refers to the idea of the kind of particular and self-consciously new social, political and economic configurations that are meant to have been created by the revolutions of the early modern period and industrialization. And at its heart lies the position that Western polities and societies which emerge in the 18th and 19th centuries are really very profoundly different from those which have preceded them. That's the basic idea. And at the time, in the 18th and 19th centuries, they're actually progressing towards a higher, perhaps the highest form of political authority in the form of the liberal democratic state. And so, as you might imagine, there are lots of historical chronologies that implicitly and explicitly follow this paradigm. So, of seeing transitions from the pre-modern to the modern era. So, you've got agrarian versus market economies. You've got corporate or monarchical states versus the modern state, religion as opposed to science, ritual as opposed to bureaucracy. And these sorts of narratives are regularly criticised by medieval historians. If I had been sitting down there, I would have described myself as like in a sandwich of two historians who have done a lot to critique these narratives. But the question I want to ask is, how does Susan's work speak as a fundamental challenge to them? So with Kingdoms and Communities, it challenges and overturns many fundamentally chronological assumptions. So first, that the European Central Middle Ages was too hierarchical to support collective solidarities. It overturns the assumption that there were no states, no sense of the public welfare or public interest until the very late Middle Ages. It's interesting that the implication of this position, that actually society is not so hierarchical that it cannot support solidarities, are actually not really, the implications for that for feudalism were never really picked up. Hence, in some way, the desire, the need to produce Fiefs and Vassals, which in some way can be read as the negative side of kingdoms and communities in a very interesting way. And it also offers these very profound critiques of 19th century views of the Middle Ages, either as a period of Gemeinschaft, so natural communities of common will, and in addition to Weber's sense that we kind of see the move from traditional to patrimonial government in this period as well. And she's very, very critical of both these narratives. She writes at the end of the book, these types of narratives which result in labelling some periods of history as more primitive and some as more advanced, so that one is invited either to yearn nostalgically for a supposed primitive harmony in the early stages, or to applaud the greater cleverness or intellectual subtlety of those who made the grade to later ones. The book, it confuses, it upsets narratives of progress, which labels some practices as modern and others not, and therefore consigning to them to the past and or irrelevancy. And elsewhere in Kingdom, she takes on the idea of the family. She writes, other examples of the survival of the developmental typologies of the 19th century can be found in attempts to make a chronological sequence during the Middle Ages from kinship to lordship, or from personal to territorial government, with the full concept of the state reserved to be a final, modern achievement. And she continues, if it can be right at all to regard the family or kin as chronologically prior to other communities, then the time at which it existed alone in Europe, unsupplemented by lordship and other forms of community, was long past the Middle Ages. And there's actually been a lot written now since the 1980s on the autonomy granted to modern Western kinship, this idea that Western kinship is this autonomous force. And its very modernity is actually something that Hans Hummer critiques in a very recent book called Visions of Kinship, the idea that our version of family was not their version of family. But in the same way with Philippe Bourque on ritual, it appears that, at least in passing, Susan got there first. And Fiefs and Vassals does something similar. We start immediately, not with the medieval period itself, but with the 18th and 19th centuries, and how the whole medieval period, all of it, from the fall of Rome to the Renaissance, gets classed as feudal. In Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. And the book, as we know, it breaks this down. It brings feudal as a legal idea back, not to the early Middle Ages, but instead to the age of learned law and the compilation of the Libri Feudorum, the books of fiefs. The construction of the Middle Ages as feudal, writes Susan, resembles more its incorporation as part of the civil law tradition, which is, as a pan-Christendom phenomenon, a late medieval phenomenon. But even that late medieval phenomenon, she argued, was profoundly dynamic. It was alive, where its modern counterpart had a profoundly staticizing effect. And one could go on. John's already mentioned her paper on skepticism, based around critiquing the idea that, quote, people in the Middle Ages were less critical and rational than modern people, and that religious faith therefore came naturally to them. And this paper, I mean, I don't think it can be really underestimated just how creative it was at the time when it was written, because now it seems so obvious, even though it still reads so freshly. But it allowed the possibility of unbelief. It allowed the possibility of even the denial of God in an age of belief, of unbelief, of inscribing the importance of structures, of context, of culture, into the options which are available for individuals to think with. So Susan doesn't create a Middle Ages full of atheists, but rather she reframes our view, thinking about what was understood by doubt, how did it manifest. So buried at the heart of Susan's work then is a stubborn, dogged, determined refusal to accept easy chronological narratives about the modern West, and narratives that mean that certain sections of the past can be drawn off, parcelled off, and excluded, or seen as preludes for other more important things. So how does she do it, more briefly? And she does it by a deceptively simple criticism, a critique in some way of language. So in a paper published in 1985 in the Journal of British Studies, entitled What Do We Mean by Anglo-Saxon and Anglo-Saxon, she wrote words. Words are and always have been used in real life, that is loosely, with overlapping and inconsistent connotations, and above all changing their significance through time. I used this paper not because it was the first time she said anything like this, but its measured tone is in some way contrasted to the way in which she would make this point in IHR seminars, where she would slap the table and say, words, words, words! You know, when I say table, you know I mean this table, not a table in a book. And there is in her work a repeated injunction to distinguish between words, concepts, and phenomena. She constantly repeats that historians confuse words for the underlying phenomena. The idea that, this is her criticism, is that if there is not our word for states, then there were no states. She writes, attention has, for instance, been focused on the use of the word status, apparently in the belief that it will reveal ideas about the state. This is surely misdirected. Instead, what we should study is the thing itself, that is, the reality of the political systems concerned. For Susan, taking modern words, which are not part of the particular local vocabulary, distorts not only their underlying concepts, but may also serve to misrecognize the phenomena under consideration. She writes, and John's said this already, the confusion of modern and medieval ideas that follow from using words like oligarchy, patriciate, or borough, let alone borough status, also crop up more than once. In her second collection of essays, her preface asks the question, when, for instance, historians refer to those who witnessed a lord's charter in 11th century France as the vassals of that lord, even when the word is not used in the charter, what do they think the word would have meant in that context if it had been used? In another essay, medieval historians have come to take fiefs and vassalage so much for granted that they have barely worried about the confusion of words, concepts, and phenomena that seem to be involved in most discussions of medieval political ideas and forms of property. So this focus on words, she argued, allowed her to see the phenomena she was trying to identify, solidarities, states, ideas about rights and obligations in their context, within their time, and not from a vantage point that was formed, as history as an academic discipline was itself forming, that is, from the later 19th century, and which has its own inheritance. So, to sum up, I think one of the interesting things looking forward about Susan's work was actually her interlocutors. For all of her focus on the meaning of meaning, the imperfectness of words, the imperfectness of signs and their signifiers, she was not part of the linguistic term. Her focus on words, concepts and phenomena came from the same era as many of her historiographical interlocutors, so the early 20th century, with Weber, with Turney's, Sotu, Ogden and Richards. She was deeply concerned with historical method, urging that historians pay more attention to how they prove things. In the IHR interview that has been an absolute privilege to listen to, she calls very briefly on Karl Popper, but she doesn't develop it, with the question of asking, were things falsifiable? But she did not ever develop this into a full-scale historical method, a written sense of what her own method was, how she came to her conclusions, why she did not change her mind. And instead, she focused on the ideas of reason and evidence. One also needs evidence, evidence which must be critically assessed and rationally argued, whether or not it fits one's assumptions and hypotheses. When telling us to avoid labelling societies, she enjoined us to, it does not mean avoiding big questions and generalizations about whole societies, but approaching them only after or alongside consideration of the evidence of the phenomena covered by the generalization. We need, she wrote, to combine bold hypotheses with the testing of them with evidence. Elsewhere, analogies prove nothing. What matters is the evidence. And this one can see in her work. Fiefs and Vassals is a mammoth assemblage of evidence. And this sometimes led responses to her work to consider it only in its empirical terms, to treat it in the positivist sense that she was in some ways decried. And this sometimes led to the overall response to her work being from subject specialists, saying she got this wrong, or she got that wrong, rather than seeing the whole intervention as the point. And as an aside, Susan was always extremely dignified and very open to receiving this criticism. But I do wonder also that it must have been quite difficult at certain points to have the whole, to have rather the trees being taken for the wood. And part of this, I think, part of this confusion was because Susan's interlocutors were from the late 19th and early 20th century. So despite her interest in words, she was not actually interested, as actually John's alluded to, that much in texts and textual construction, and in particular their construction of their particular use of language. So not for her was an essay like The Language of Fiefs in Galbert of Bruges. No, no, no. It was the textual archival context that was key to the context in which these words were used. And in some senses that's surprising, I think, given her early work in the VCH and the fact that her earliest publications were on forgeries. And I think this also sometimes means that she did not necessarily destabilize the medieval chronologies she was working with. She ended Kingdoms and Communities on a rather apologetic note, in a way, about her sense of chronological change, her explanation of chronological change. She wrote she had not found much, but she did know there was an explosion of vocabulary at the end of her period. And in the final paragraph she says, well, this must be caused by social and economic expansion. And it's a rather apologetic conclusion in a way. And Fiefs and Vassals itself could be read as supporting traditional narratives of state formation rather than undermining them. But none of this is really the point. The point is that Susan's work, although she wanted so much to convince, was much, much more about making people better, about making them better historians, about making them think more, about producing work that really was generative and that changed the way other people thought about a very far-gone society. She may, as she admitted, have been wrong about Fiefs de reprise, but she certainly made us think harder and better about the words we use for the work we do.
Thank you very much indeed. Our final speaker is David Davray, Professor Emeritus from UCL. David, would you?
When this was first being discussed, and we were talking rather freely, with I think David Bates and Pauline Stafford, I said that whereas some historians feel that their work is autobiography, and I was thinking of Alexander Murray had said this to me, and he said Arnaldo Mobiliano had said the same thing. I don't think this was true of Susan, and Pauline said, no, you're wrong, actually, because the legal background of her family was an important influence on her whole way of thinking, and that's something that I want to come back to, because I do think it's a key to many aspects of her as a historian. So I've known Susan for probably longer than almost anyone here. Before she came to London, I do remember inviting her to lunch at UCL, which is, believe me, not like inviting somebody to lunch at All Souls. There was some sort of table service, but it was the same very uninspiring menu. But somehow I had a sense that I wanted to meet her, and this was well before Fiefs and Vassals, I think, and before she came to London. And so then I've known her well over the years, and then in her last years, I took to visiting her very regularly because she was very close to UCL, where I worked, and especially I saw a great deal of her in her last weeks. I think together with her family who were present breaking the COVID rules to do so. And it was strange going through a deserted London to go and see Susan. I can remember one of the last things she said to me when I mentioned quite a famous and very good historian. She said, "Not a very good historian." And Susan could be quite critical. In what I'm going to say, I don't want to make it hagiography. And I do think that one should paint a portrait of her as a historian, warts and all. And so I'm going to do what I never really did with her in life, which is perhaps even dissent a little bit. There was a reason for that. I remember a dinner party at her house, and I remember Peggy Brown as being there. Maybe I imagined this, but I remember her as being there, and this was before Fiefs and Vassals came out. And I said to Susan that I wanted, before, she hadn't finished writing, she was near. I wanted to discuss it with her, because of course I taught feudalism, and as did David Carpenter. And I thought there were some things she needed to hear. She said, no, I don't want to have the discussion, I'm just going to write it now. And subsequently, I never had that discussion with her, because we all loved her so much that we couldn't argue with her about feudalism. And I still remember all the times I used to go and see her and discuss with her, she would try and edge around the subject of feudalism, and and how people were gradually coming to see that she was right about it, and I would have to edge away from the subject and gradually turn the conversation in different directions. But as you'll see by the time I'm finished, I admire her enormously as a historian. But what I was told to do was to talk about her legacy as a historian. So I'm not going to talk about her really rather remarkable path to the books she wrote. I've done that at length in the British Academy memoir that I wrote with John Hudson. It's available to everybody online. It's very full and long, as these things go, because after the many conversations that I was privileged to have with her, I did have a pretty good sense of all that she remembered about her life, at any rate. Also, I think I know her published work pretty well as well. Nevertheless, I do have to say, it was a very remarkable career. It was very different from a normal academic career when she was young, which would be a clever young man gets a brilliant first, and perhaps a postmastership at Merton for a year, and then he gets a job without ever doing a PhD. The sort of, the James Campbell model, if you like. And there was a generation then of people who were proud not to have a PhD, because, if you had a PhD, it showed you weren't clever enough to get a job on your own brilliant first degree. And her life, her career was also entirely different from the modern model, which would be somebody, does brilliant first degree, does an MA of a kind that hardly existed, at least it wasn't a normal path in those days, because he went straight into a PhD, does a PhD, gets a research fellowship at the IHR or at Oxbridge College or a British Academy postdoc, and then, if they're lucky, get a permanent academic job. Now, you know how Susan got her job. And I have to say, it's a good advertisement for the old girl network, because it certainly worked. But it's a slightly mysterious alchemy about how it works so well, because you can see she started. She didn't do a PhD. She had a better training than the PhDs of those days gave, certainly at Oxford or Cambridge, because she learned paleography from Hector. Very good teacher of paleography. Some of you may have used his textbook on paleography. It's a superb, best teaching book on paleography properly. She was taught by him, and then the VCH was a training. So you can't underestimate the amateurism of graduate training at British universities back when she was young. So she was actually better trained. But she starts with working on these small communities, and then she works on English towns, and then she is doing kingdoms and community. And I'm going to end with, I'm going to come back to that at the end, because I think that's her greatest legacy. But something remarkable was happening to her, which was very unusual among teachers of that time, because mostly in those days people taught British history or English history and European history. Now, Susan often said, and she was right, that this did at least mean that medievalists in the UK did pay attention to countries other than their own, because it had an apartheid Bantustan existence separate from English history. So she and other teachers at Oxford taught European history as well as English history, and London was exactly the same. We had our sequence of English history papers. I think it was English history until Caroline Barron made us bring Scotland into it. Yes, Caroline, I remember. And then there were European papers of somewhat shorter periods, I suppose, logically. Now, people taught like this at Oxford and London, and I'm sure many other places. Cambridge was the same, actually. And they never thought, really, of bringing these together. Now, I mean, obviously, some people did, but what Susan did was remarkable in that her base was really in English history, and then she expanded it to the whole of Europe while bringing her close knowledge of English history to bear on it. And she did something which, many in Oxford has not done, which is she made herself learn German, realizing what a fundamental language it is for medieval studies. And in fact, she learned to read everything she needed to read. I think she was rather good at it. I remember her picking up a Swedish book in the IHR common room and managing to decipher it. So she had a bit of an instinct to read things. But she learned German really well, and that's something that most of other people, other medievalists at Oxford in her day, I think on the whole didn't bother to do. And she did it because she was in, and at some point, this is something I never fully understood, and I tried to get her to talk about it a little bit, is how her interests were expanding in this way. Something rather marvelous was happening in her head, where she really wanted to take in the whole of European history. And she used to complain that people wouldn't talk to her about it. She used to say, Maurice Keane, she liked him, examined with him, but he wouldn't talk to her about it. I think actually what she probably meant is he wouldn't listen to her. Because she was always so sweet and benevolent, but she wasn't really a good listener. She was better at objecting, really, than taking in counter-arguments, I suppose. But she says, anyway, for one reason or another, she didn't find people to listen to her. Barbara Harvey would, but I think that was, again, Barbara Harvey was not very interested in European history, I don't think, but she was prepared to listen. And Susan often reverted to this, how that Barbara Harvey was the only one whom she could talk to about these things. But I think maybe the thing was that her crossover between English and European was something that didn't really find much resonance among her colleagues at the time. Anyway, out of this alchemy came kingdoms and communities, which I want to come back to at the end. But really what I want to talk about before that is law and how that affected her. So this idea that Pauline Stafford gave to me. Her last book on eminent domain is a real historical study of law, and that was uppermost in her mind. But Fiefs and Vassals, I think, is particularly important as a contribution to legal history. I'll explain why. It had the bad side of law, in that Susan brought up with this dynasty of lawyers, at least father, grandfather. She did history like a lawyer. She argued for her client, which would be her thesis, and she would argue with all her might. And she argued extremely well. Occasionally her client was guilty. Still argued extremely well. And actually, I don't think you need to be afraid to talk about feudalism. For goodness sake, it's not something invented by the clergy. Why on earth are small landowners in part of the Security Council in Magna Carta just because they hold land directly from the king? How on earth is it that people who wouldn't accept that the king had a right to tax, nonetheless accept that he has a right to choose husbands for their sons and daughters because they hold land from him? Questions like this are the ones that I would have argued with Susan about had she accepted when she was still writing this book. But what most people don't notice about this book is its real achievement, which is that she, unique among historians of in this country, realised the importance of the Libri Feudorum. Now, it was in the context, of course, for her. She had a line of argument which was feudalism is invented by these Roman lawyers who were working on the Libri Feudorum, and that's where the whole thing came from. Well, as you can see, I don't agree with that, but nonetheless, she saw the importance of the Libri Feudorum, which was completely unstudied by English language historians at the time. And she studied them and got her head around them, and I think it's a huge contribution of that book that she drew attention to it as a really major, because when people think of Roman law in the Middle Ages, they don't think of the Libri Feudorum, but they're totally part of the corpus of Roman law, studied intensely all over Europe. And I think, one of the things that historians should do when looking at other historians is be discriminating. Historians make mistakes all the time, and one of the jobs of other historians is to find the gold that's sometimes mixed up with some things that are mistaken. But Kingdoms and Communities, I don't think was mistaken at all, and I do think that's her masterpiece. I mean, if we talk about her legacy, she didn't have PhD students. She has a huge legacy in terms of everybody she encouraged in the IHR, etc. That's a huge legacy. But I think really the greatest legacy is that book, Kingdoms and Communities. As some of you know, when I was reading it on the Underground, I missed my stop because I was so engrossed by it. And Kingdoms and Communities is not trying to prove something negative. It's trying to prove something positive. It's trying to prove exactly the importance of these connectivities. And it had the two remarkable things about it, especially given the specialization that is the great bane of academic life in general. She did it at all levels. It's true, not religious communities, but all lay communities. She did it at all levels. And she did it right across England, France, and Germany. And that was really remarkable and creative. And I think that book is going to be a classic. I don't think that's ever going to be outdated or out of style. So if I had to, my pick for Susan Reynolds, I mean, okay, the English Towns book, it's a nice book, I must say.
Susan was pleased that it was the only book that was still making her money, right?
Right, okay. And it got a very positive review in Annal, too. Nonetheless, I mean, let's say Bristol in the Middle Ages, we're not talking about Florence, and we're not even talking about Paris. So really, the most interesting English town is London, frankly, in the Middle Ages. So anyway, but Kingdoms and Communities, I think that is her absolutely lasting legacy. I think people will be reading that and being inspired by it in 100 years' time.
Thank you very much. We do actually have a little bit of time. So if there were questions or further things, I mean, if the speakers would like to disagree with each other.
Yes, please. One of the things Susan points out in the preface to either the second or first, is that there were lots of collectivities, lay collectivities, not just monastic or ecclesiastical ones, which she was not talking about. Family, noble household, armies, Jews, mercantile companies. She lists a whole list of them. I mean, I think they're so right about her legal background, the family background. She's interested in the law of property and the relation of property owners to the government. And that's what is the central core throughout her work and the sorts of evidence she wanted to focus on.
A successful solicitor's daughter.
Yeah, that's well.
So I'm Ian, her nephew. I'm sorry, I'm not a historian, but there was a word, there was a phrase that you used which was very, very, very important, and I don't understand it. Libri Feudalis?
Libri Feudorum, yeah, okay. So the Libri Feudorum, I'm sorry, and that was my bad for not explaining it. Okay, so there's the Roman law is basically a vast compilation made in the 6th century by Justinian of previous judgments and opinions by Roman jurists, and this became very widely studied from the 12th century on, but added to it were a series of laws made in feudal language, if I may say so, by German emperors. And these were part of the body that was studied. And that is in itself an extremely interesting phenomenon, the fact that they were just, because people didn't think the Roman Empire would ever end. As far as they were concerned, it was the Roman Empire all the way from Augustus up to Frederick II and so on. They didn't know they were in the Middle Ages. They didn't know that antiquity had ended. And so these laws were put together with the laws of emperors that Justinian had and these were commented on, thought about, together with all the laws of late antiquity. So it's actually a huge historical fact that went on. Alice has something to say about that.
I do. I suppose, I mean, Fiefs and Vassals, your criticism of Fiefs and Vassals, I wonder if it's slightly, not unfair, but maybe a bit unfair. I mean, in the sense that the way I read it is the reason why she divides it into these two chronological sections is to, and again this point about her interlocutors being the early 20th century, is to completely get rid of this idea that you have, the feudal system in the early Middle Ages. And that's the kind of like Germanic ethos of the feud, and as in terms of the fief. But of course the issue is that no one thought that anymore in 1997. So that kind of point was never quite...
But they taught it in school.
They taught it in school,
yeah,
they did teach it.
Yeah.
And so that question of one of the things that would have been, in the aftermath of that, one of the things I think would have been really great if Susan had done would be to do the kind of thing that she advocated in her emergence of the legal professional kind of article in 2003, which is a fantastic article where she talks about kind of Roman law and to need to understand it as a culture, not as a question of did they understand it, did they not, but where is it and how is it used. And she never really did that for the Liber Feudalorum, because the Liber Feudalorum, although it kind of emerges in the 12th century and it goes through a number of compilations in the 12th century, it doesn't actually get added to the idea of the corpus juris civilis until the 13th century. So there's a kind of late medieval, beginnings of late medieval culture there, which would have been really interesting to kind of do that work. And and again, people who knew her much better than I did would be able to have a sense of why, in the aftermath of the Vassals, she didn't go on to do that more substantive work in terms of explaining what that kind of culture based around feudal/Roman law actually looked like. Not only in the German Empire, but also in kind of parts of the French kingdom and in Italy, and and that's still and so there's a kind of. So I wonder also if there's a, to the criticism about that sense of, the interesting point about Magna Carta is more that this offers a point of transmission, so to speak, that cannot really be explained by the Liber Feudalorum. It can't be
absolutely. That's
so,
right. Completely not. No, that's right. No, I mean, I disagree with, I agree with both of your points, which is that for her, the Liber Feudalorum were an expert witness for the prosecution of the case against feudalism. Trying to prove that they had faked the evidence for feudalism, and so it was kind of by accident, but nonetheless she put it on the map. Now, and so what you said, we wouldn't have been you wouldn't have been thinking that if she hadn't written about it. We'd be going on our happy way, ignoring the Liber Feudalorum whereas now somebody will do it.
Yeah, it's true. There's much that I think about now that I would not have thought about. I think that's
so breadth of vision, and then her world history in her later life.
I think that's clearly true, and that's what Stefan Putzel was saying. We knew what the model of Fiefs and Vassals feudal structure was. There were people putting question marks against it of articles. I was taught by someone who absolutely didn't believe in it. But he never published his views till they were published. He wrote an article in the 1960s
Because
early account, John Prestwich, but it wasn't published till after his death. You know, he wasn't, you know, all these questions, but no one, despite Peggy Brown's clarion call, no one actually wrote a head-on assault on a model.
Peggy Brown's best work is not that.
And who has said it was?
Well,
not me. I mean, my view of at present, until I get demolished, hopefully, of the Libri Theodorum and those Italian lawyers, is that they were coming up theorizing, while pretending to be continuing Roman law, in new ways which merely gave a kind of gloss, a theoretical gloss, to old practices. And this is really what academics, that's what we're here for. To, in some way, interpret what's been going on in the past and which we've, ideas which we've accumulated, and make us and our contemporaries think, cool, aren't we up to date with it? You know, we're doing the latest thing. And all we're doing is putting a new loose covers.
where of course she was right,
on the old practices.
is attacking the idea of a feudal system. And indeed, if you look at how people are taught medieval history in schools, you've got the king, the barons, the knights, and the peasants, and the idea that that is the system. And of course that's wrong, but if you see feudalism as being one mental structure along many others, some of them more important, to try and keep society running and keeping it together, one element in the mind, one mentality in the mind.
Do you have a rough a sense how many elements you want to keep together in your mind at any one moment?
Kingdoms and communities would be another obvious one. Yes, but
sorry,
but the idea that there's one. So if the idea that there's one key to a society, yeah, obviously that's wrong.
Yeah.
We do have a couple of questions at the back, I think.
You want me to?
Yes.
Right, I'm speaking as a late medievalist, and you'll be glad to know we don't discuss feudalism. I want to say something about Susan. You know, the early medieval seminar sort of takes over as if that's her seminar, but she came to the medieval London seminar, and Susan was a great supporter of that. So she's not just an early medieval. More than that. And I think her book on medieval English towns is really brilliant and really useful book. And I would like to say two things about Susan. One is that I think her greatest, I shouldn't say that, a great contribution she made was to make us realise that not all medieval people were very devout. That she brought out the fact that, yes, they didn't spend their whole time on their knees in church worrying about purgatory. They actually did get on with their lives in a secular sense. And I think she brought that out, and I think that was quite important. But I want to say one thing about Susan, which is about a more personal thing. Many of you will know Jane Martindale, who is a medieval historian whom Susan admired very much and who was a good friend. And they couldn't have been more different. Jane loved footnotes. In fact, she'd rather write a footnote than a text. A great footnote person. And she and Susan were very different, but they were good friends. And when Jane was bringing together her collected papers, she never wrote the great book she should have written, and she was having difficulty doing that and bringing it all together, it was Susan who helped her, and it was Susan who compiled the index for Jane's collected papers. And I think actually there are many, many acts of kindness, of efficiency, of organisation that Susan brought to the work of all of us in different ways. And for a moment, let's forget feudalism and remember all the other things that she did for all of us.
Just one, listening to that discussion, excellent discussion, but listening in particular to David, I suddenly thought, we've all missed something out, and we've all missed out a very important person. It was when David said England, France and Germany. Well, Susan had a great friend, and he and I were colleagues at one stage in our lives, named Rhys Davies. And Rhys and Susan discussed, in inverted commas, states. And this is one of the... yes, don't get him grimacing.
It was the inverted commas I didn't like.
Yeah, well, I was using states with due deference to Rhys.
They disagreed, I think.
They did. Oh, they did. They disagreed profoundly. But of course, they were also very, very close friends. I mean, Susan thanked Rhys for making her think in many, many ways about how to stand up for her own point of view. And Rhys had a personal generosity which paralleled that of Susan. So really, all I'm doing in a way is saying, and I'll say a little bit more about this when I conclude the whole session. Susan truly was a remarkable person, the breadth of her interests. But I just thought, well, Rhys Davies does deserve a mention. And not just Rhys Davies, but the controversy around, without inverted commas, I think you might need Henry Digger, with or without inverted commas, states. Any observations on that first?
Susan was right. It's only because he was Welsh. He didn't like to think that, you know, but obviously there wasn't a state in Wales, so...
Well, Susan wanted it to be a state in Wales, I think. Yeah, I mean, actually, I by and large concluded that, except Rhys, of course, was capable of broadening the discussion to England, France. Anyway, so leave that one to one side, but it was just a bit more about Susan's life, which packed, and another person in Susan's life, which was very, very important. That's it.
I mean,
Alice.
I mean, in the sense of, you know, when I was an undergraduate, and I actually kind of went to the last time Rhys Davies gave his series of lectures on basically the peoples of Britain and Ireland that's another story. But it was, and what was so extraordinary is right at the start of that series of lectures is Susan Reynolds. You know, and the kind of defining concept of the First English Empire is the idea of regular solidarity, that he explicitly kind of takes from her and from communities, and is very clear about that intellectual depth. And in preparation for this talk, I went back and read one on medieval Origines Gentium, and the idea of the community of the realm, which, you know, I mean, it's an astonishing paper. Because it's still, you know, it reads as though it could have been written, you know, just a few years ago. You know, there's the kind of the freshness of it, where she's talking about storytelling, basically, and how how these stories about, you know, what people say, where they come from, you know, why they are where they are, and the clarity with which she makes that argument that, you know, these are territorial associations. You know, first of all, it's still kind of convincing now, and she's able to, unlike what I said in my paper, she is very able to put forward a clear chronological document there as well. But it's also very interesting that Rhys Davies didn't kind of agree with her actually about states. I mean, like it's odd in a way, because he so very much took her idea of regular solidarity, you know, and absolutely motivated the later part of her work. But I wonder it was because Rhys was not so much interested in language and the translatability of language across time and culture as Susan was, which is odd given his, you know, given the fact that he grew up a Welsh speaker, and, you know, and English was his second language, and so there's an interesting kind of dynamic there, but to the idea that, you know, in the last part of his life, that her work was, you know, foundational to him, as much as the other way around.
Yeah. No, I mean, just to reflect. No, stop me.
David, have a say, David.
No. All I was going to say is, of course, just following up on that. Dobbit Brood, who you know well, Dobbit maintained that finally Rhys became almost English, or at least the first English empire was empire, in a way which Susan, she would have objected, I think, to his use of the word empire. And she thought of empire in a very different way from Rees. But anyway, we could continue this and I won't.
Thank you very much indeed. If I can ask all of you now just to thank our speakers again for and now, yes, just to welcome David back to conclude the proceedings.
Well, I will say first of all that Claire has asked me to conclude the proceedings for reasons which will become obvious very soon. But before I get to that stage in my brief conclusion, I am going to ask all of us together to send our best wishes to Pauline Stafford. Pauline, as David has already said, really he, myself and Pauline, and I think it is fair to say above all Pauline, were the great driving forces of this event and this tribute to a truly remarkable person and historian. And it is actually this which leads me on to thank all the contributors. It has actually been a profoundly moving afternoon and also a profoundly enlightening one. And it is quite clear that disagreements between some of our speakers notwithstanding, that actually Susan has made us all reflect this afternoon on a person, but also on the history and histories which have been written during our lives, some of them quite long ones. Now for the reason why I am doing this, and namely it's my responsibility to thank the staff of the IHR for organising this event. Claire, first of all, for listening to Pauline, David and myself and taking on board the need for such an event. And I hope also, as I look towards the family, I hope that it has been an appropriate reflection for all of you.
Awesome.
Okay. No, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You will have a chance to say a little bit more later. I'll come on to that when I get on to the final uncontroversial subject at the end. First of all to Claire, and of course Adam has been at the centre of all the organisation. Kate, who is sitting over there, has done so much to put together material and also to persuade Robert Lyons to make that statement, which I think is an extremely important commentary on Susan as a member of the IHR community. And behind the scenes, and she's probably dealing with the final point, Gemma Dormer, who quietly works away behind the scenes to organise all of this at the IHR. So, thank you very much. Of course, Claire couldn't do this. That's why I'm doing it. Thank you very much to Adam, well, to those people and to the staff of the IHR for organising this profoundly moving and enlightening event. And my final, utterly uncontroversial point, Susan would certainly have agreed with this, a glass of wine in the corner. On we go.